Hey everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to Neurojournal Club. Now just for quick shopkeeping, if you've been liking my videos, please go ahead and subscribe. If you like this one today, please click the thumbs up. And if you can support me at all, please click the Patreon link below and keep me fed here on lockdown in Nepal. Cool. So what are we going to talk about today? So in the last couple videos, we've talked about how attention can be modulated by meditation. But as I've told you, meditation isn't really about developing some crazy Jedi mind tricks. It's about trying to find inner peace. So today we're going to ask the question, what does meditation claim to teach? So goals of meditation. So there's suffering in the world. That's pretty obvious. And the idea behind a lot of Buddhist philosophy, at least, is that wrong views drive the suffering. So it's an incorrect perception of the world that creates suffering, this dissonance between what you believe to be and what actually is. So if we correct the wrong views, then we end the suffering. Simple, okay, but what are the right views? So dependent origination is this world system or idea that Buddhist philosophy has come up with for how wrong views come about. And let's take a look at what that is. So just first, one little inspirational quote. Whoever sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. Whoever sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. So the idea here being that if you can recognize dependent origination at an experiential level, then you will reach enlightenment. So dependent origination. Existence through interaction. Nothing has any kind of fundamental existence. Everything only exists through its interaction with other things. And liberation comes when this truth is experienced. So you're not going to get liberated by watching this video. You have to actually experience this truth rather than just intellectually talk about it. But the intellectual talking about it is still kind of cool. And just so you know, today, all the information that we're going to be talking about is from a paper from Sopa from 1986. So, dependent origination is based on 12 nidanas, 12 components, and we're going to run through what are those 12 components and think about how they interrelate to each other to bring about suffering and wrong views. So the first nidana is not knowing, or avidya. So this is different from ignorance, where ignorance is just a lack of knowledge. In this case, not knowing is meant to connote an actual knowing of a wrong thing. And it is the ultimate root of suffering. Anytime there's this dissonance between what actually is and what one knows is going to lead to some kind of suffering. And this generally manifests as any knowledge besides the ultimate knowledge of nothingness. So if everything is fundamentally just interrelated and has no actual base existence, anytime that there's a belief in something having a base existence, such as I or that chair over there, there's going to be some kind of suffering as a result. The second component that we'll talk about is action, or samskara karma. So action in the dependent origination theory is based on wrong view, component one, and an action could be anything. So you could have perceiving a thing which is not there, such as perceiving an eye, perceiving that chair, or reacting to a thing that is not there, which is everything that is not there. And these actions are just seeds. And what that means is that they don't have any persistence through time. They just happen, and then they're over. So they don't really have much causal ability to do anything in the world, but they're kind of taking that knowledge which sits inert, that non-knowledge or that wrong view knowledge from component one, and they're turning it into something that is actionable, but it's still happening in just a snap. It doesn't persist through time. So then consciousness is the third component, vijnana. Now, consciousness is the thing based on this seeded action from component two that allows it to exist through time. Because as we just talked about, a perception or a reaction lasts for an instant and it's gone. But consciousness provides persistence through time. You can be conscious of that chair from moment to moment to moment to moment. So then the fourth component is going to be name or form, namarupa. So name, form, based on consciousness persisting through time, and consciousness has no identity. So I'm conscious of that chair over there, but at some kind of basic level, it's not a chair. I don't have a name for a chair, and so without a name, the chair can't really exist. And so its contents has no form. In naming a thing, it becomes real. So as soon as I say, oh yeah, that's the chair over there, it groups together all of the components of things that could be that chair and puts them into a form, gives them a reality that they didn't have before. And the same thing can happen when talking about an I or a me. So then the fifth component that we'll talk about are the six senses. Now you may be confused talking about six senses. So these are the five senses that we're used to talking about. So hearing, sight, touch, smell, taste. But in addition, there's mind sense. So this is a way that Buddhist philosophy thinks about the way in which your mind is really a sense organ itself and is constantly looking at something. Whether that thing is internally generated or comes in from the five senses doesn't really matter. The mind is itself, in some ways, a sense organ. So how does this sixth sense component really fit into the dependent origination? So, as you may be noticing, each component is based on the one before. So it's based on this increasing set of named things that came from component 4. So each named thing is going to be experienced independently by the senses. I can see the chair, I can touch the chair, probably can't really smell the chair, but you get the idea. And things seen, but the things are seen by all of the senses. There's always this unified experience of any particular thing that's being seen. I can feel, touch, and smell, and taste, and I can hear, and I can have a mental idea about all of this, and all of it happens at the same time in thinking about me. So the senses are then tied together. You start to realize that any particular thing is experienced by consciousnesses of all of the senses at the same time. These consciousnesses are all simultaneously experiencing the same thing, and so the six senses now become tied together. This is now the building of a person, of an ego, of a self. Then the sixth component that we'll talk about is contact, or sparsha. So contact based on the unification of the six senses. Things are experienced now by the six senses. And the unified six senses form an entity which contacts with objects. If there are these six senses that are united together and experiencing things, then those things are now separate or external. We now have objects being external to the self. So there becomes this separation where before there was an idea of universal nothingness at the base of everything. Now we've built up this wrong view to a point where there are actually objects that are external to some kind of a self based on six senses. And then the seventh component is feeling, or vedana. So feeling based on contact with objects. If objects are external, then the universe is not all one. And preferences are then possible. So if the universe is all one thing, one grand united singularity, then you can't really have preferences. Do I want this part of the oneness or that part of the oneness? Well, it's all oneness, so you can't have a preference. But as soon as you have separations between an object and a self, well, there's other objects, different objects. And each object could be something that you have a preference for. You might like this object and dislike that object. So different feelings for different objects. And then the eighth component is craving, or trishna. So craving, based on feelings, component 7, is pretty straightforward. You can have cravings for positive feelings. You like this object, the feelings that this object gives you, and so you crave for that object, for the feelings that it gives you. And you can have aversion for a negative object. So you don't like the feelings that this object gives you, so you have aversion towards this object. You avoid this object. So over time, these cravings can be built into attachments, upadana. So attachment, based on cravings. As time passes, there is attachment to cravings. So we have this craving for a particular object, and over time, we keep on craving that object and craving that object and craving that object until there becomes this kind of meta craving. An attachment is kind of a craving to the craving almost. We get attached to craving. It becomes a part of us. And the strongest attachment is to the me, I, and mine. So attachment to craving is an addiction. It's something that we get stuck into, we get attached to. And these attachments then feed habits, or bhava. So habit, based on attachments, we create habitual ways of being that feed the attachments. So you have an attachment to a particular thing, to a particular craving, and you create a habit so that you can constantly get more and more and more of that thing that you're craving, of that thing that you have attachment towards. This is the basis of maladaptive character flaws, ultimately rooted, again, in not knowing. And from this we get birth, or jati. So this is based on the habits that form an individual character, component 10. So we have this cluster of habits that brings into existence an individual self, and that persists through time and experiences and acts. So where before we had this habit and that habit and the other habit, now we start to define an overall self that is defined by this cluster of habits and has this ability to exist and persist through time. And then finally we have age, death, jara marana. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. So age, death, based on the existence of the individual. Nothing can die if it didn't exist first. So an individual existing through time is unstable. If the basic truth of the universe is that everything is nothing and all one, then the idea of an individual that exists for only some period of time and is separate from the rest of the universe is a very unstable idea. Eventually, it breaks up, and this is aging, death. And is it any surprise that this thing that was born ages and dies when all that it is a collection of habits built to feed attachments to particular cravings for particular feelings that occur when we have contact with objects that are felt by the six senses that were brought together by name and nothing more, as a result of the realization that they had temporally overlapping consciousnesses associated with them that allowed actions to persist through time, and these actions were based on an incorrect view, a not knowing about the fundamental nature of the universe. So I don't know how much I agree with this or disagree with this, and I'm not asking you to disagree or agree with it, and if you do, that's great. But the idea here from a Buddhist philosophical standpoint is that through meditation, we kind of work our way backwards through these components. It's obvious that we can tell what age and death and birth are. Those things are pretty clear. We don't know why they happen, but we can see them. They are gross features of our perceived universe. And with a little bit of examination, we can see the habits that drive us. And maybe we can even see the attachments that those habits are built to serve. And maybe we can even see the cravings that we have attachment towards. But as we start to work further and further back down this list of components, it gets more and more abstract, and it gets harder and harder to appreciate at an experiential level. I can see my habits. When I go to pick up that cup of coffee in the morning, or even I walk into the kitchen and I immediately move to make the coffee, I can see the habit as it drives my action. But to go all the way down to some way in which my habit of drinking coffee is related to a misunderstanding of the universe's fundamental nothingness, well, I really can't appreciate that. But perhaps with enough meditation, one works one's way all the way back until you do appreciate that on the experiential level. So anyway, just a little bit of a side into Buddhist philosophy. Hope you enjoyed it. That's the video for today. Please like if you did enjoy it. Please subscribe if you want to see more. And please support me on the link below by going to Patreon and pitching in a couple bucks a month to keep these videos coming. Cool. Thank you.